Okay, if that's a type 1 error, what's a type 2 error? A type 2 error occurs when a researcher fails to reject a null hypothesis that really is false. In a typical research situation, a type 2 error means that the hypothesis test failed to detect something that was really there. So let's say, going back to our example, that, meditating really does help you sleep slightly longer, and I just failed to observe that for some reason. In that case, that's a type 2 error. Another one might be, this is going to sound a little crazy. Let's say a Martian came down to Earth, and the Martian had the idea that men and women were the same height, when in fact they're not. You could actually say that on average, men are about 3 inches taller than women. Well, if the Martian sampled just a few men and a few women, the Martian might conclude, holy cow, they are of the same height. And I said, wait a minute, you missed it there. Maybe you sampled too few men and women, but it is actually true that men on average are taller than women. Although, of course, there's a lot of exceptions. So in that case, the Martian committed a type 2 error. He should have rejected the idea that men and women are of the same height, when in fact the Martian accepted it. He failed to reject the idea that men and women are the same height, and that's a type 2 error. We failed to observe an effect that's really there. We failed to reject the null hypothesis, which says there was no effect, if you will. And here's a nice handy graph. Just follow it. If I fail to reject the null hypothesis, and indeed the null hypothesis is true, I did the right thing. If I reject the null hypothesis, and indeed I should have rejected it, the null hypothesis is false, I did the right thing. But here are two errors. And again, I want to be careful about this word error. Error usually pardon me, denotes or connotes the idea that there was slovenliness or oversight. That's not the case here. In the fullness of time, we'll make both sorts of errors. Can't avoid it. Type 1 error happens, according to alpha, X% of the time. If alpha is consistently at 505, it's going to happen roughly 5% of the time. And what is that? I've rejected the null hypothesis when in fact there's no effect. It was out there in the critical region by chance. I rejected it, but basically the null hypothesis is true. Might we just get an aberrant or weird sample mean? Yes. Let's take that red t-shirt nonsense. Do red t-shirts really increase tips? The fullness of time has said, no, they don't. Then why the heck did we enjoy statistical significance on those problems? Who knows, just an aberration. People tipped more that day. There was something about the ions in the atmosphere. And conversely, if I fail to reject the null hypothesis, but I should have rejected it, essentially. The null hypothesis is false. That's a type 2. And I might have missed that because the sample was too low, or again, that particular sample that day just produced a weird mean, or during that experiment. You never know. It's possible to have too few participants in a study. You could have a largish effect, but if there are too few participants, you could wind up with a type 2 error. For example, going way back here, way back, fasten your seatbelts. This business with the, and I had two problems like this, like a silly goose. 4 people completing the dexterity training. Well, geez, with only 4, we failed to reject the null hypothesis, as it shows here. There's a good chance that was a type 2 error. There might have been effect for the dexterity training, and in fact, the mean suggested that. Look, 35 versus 30, but I failed to reject the null hypothesis, so it's possible I made a mistake. There's one thing I want to leave you with, and excuse all the scrolling here. The only type of error that you can make if you reject the null is type 1. That's not to say you did make the error, but that's the only type you could make. So if I rejected the null hypothesis, the only error that I could have made is type 1. If I fail to reject, the only error that I could have made is type 2. Just kind of bear that rule of heuristic in mind, that rule of thumb in mind, that heuristic. If I reject, the only type of error that I could have made is type 1. If I fail to reject, the only type of error that I could have made is type 2.